let's get back to this idea of a Christian nation, because a video was sent to me. It really was the reason why I wanted to do this. And the question was asked of him about being a Christian nation. And it's an interesting thing. His answer, if I were the person that was asking it on the microphone, I think the guy asking the question was pretty much off his rocker on some things. But I also think that Charlie missed an opportunity with some of his answer by quoting what Jesus talked about, or what the Bible talks about as far as being the ecclesia. And so the ecclesia means the government. And so his answer there, I thought, was incorrect. Ecclesia in the Greek just simply means, you'll see church is usually the way that it's translated, but it means a gathering. And it's a gathering of people, as Charlie even said, of a governing. And so, okay, even if I'm going to use his term of governing, that's fine, but it's not a governing. The church is not governed by the state. The church is governed by Jesus. He's the king. So in this case, the church is a monarchy, if you will, Jesus being the king, we being subjects of that kingdom. And so we advance accordingly. But we're not told that we are supposed to be a theocracy. We're not told that we're supposed to be a government rather that is absolutely like we had with Israel. They were a theocracy. God said, "You are my people. This is how you will be governed." They, of course, rebelled against it, but that government was put down in the law, those books of Moses. Here's what you can do. Here's what you cannot do. If you don't do these things, or if you do these things that are prohibited, here's the consequence. It's all laid out there in black and white. We have no such thing like that as far as the founding is concerned. But that brings up some really, really important matters for us to consider here. So going back to our founding, I want to bring up a slide here with two quotes. And if you were to look at just these two quotes alone, they're very, very telling. They're very important for us to understand. But if you start to read through the entirety of the founding documents, and especially when it comes to the things that Madison and Hamilton and even John Jay, who I'll be mentioning here in a moment, wrote what are known as the Federalist Papers, you're going to get an idea of how they thought we should be governed, and these were men of very deep faith. So it's an interesting thing. Could you have a government that was very much dominated with people that at very minimum had a moral worldview that was much more of the biblical sense than it was the secular? Go read their writings. It's really not a difficult question to answer. So, but does that mean that they wanted a theocracy, a God-governed people, and they were going to put a system in place that would ensure that? And you can see that that's obviously not what they were intending when they put it together. So let me bring up these quotes because I think that they're incredibly important, and they really kind of speak to where I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding. Now, the first of these two is, it's written by John Adams. Now, John Adams was our second president of the United States, and this was right after the drafting of the Constitution itself. And in this letter, it's dated October the 11th, rather, of 1798. It was written to the Massachusetts militia. And if you go read the entire address, just look up this. Just look up John Adams, October 11th, 1798, to the Massachusetts militia. You can read the entire address, and it's making the case that really is kind of encapsulated just in this one particular statement. And it says, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Now, when you read the rest in the body of the text, you'll realize what he means by this. That the Constitution itself is given so that people would have the maximum amount of freedom. And with that kind of freedom, if they are not people who are moral and religious, given that kind of freedom, it can be absolutely devastating to the country. And so the idea that people would have something that afforded them a tremendous amount of freedom, and yet if there's no governing principle in their own lives, that's a problem. So what should that governing principle be? what we would consider as the Christian or the Judeo-Christian work ethic and worldview and all those kind of things. So how it is that you interact morally, religiously, is going to influence how you react in a country that gives you enormous freedoms. And the freedoms that they would have had versus what we have now are night and day. But nonetheless, when you compare us to most countries on earth, you're still freer here than you are in most anywhere else in the world. And even when you start to think of Europe, look at the things that people are being put in jail for in Europe by just saying things or writing things. It hasn't happened here yet, not to anywhere near that extent, but you can see where it could. So here's what John Adams has to say. Again, this is before you even get to the 19th century. This is at the end of the 18th century, 1798 to be specific. So he says, our Constitution was developed in mind that the people who live here have inordinate freedoms unlike anywhere else on the planet. And in order for people to be governed with that amount of freedom, if there's no morality and there's no religious instruction, there's no belief in God, and conducting yourself in a manner that's indicative of that belief, it's going to get really, really ugly. That's his concern. So if you think about this, and we think, well, that's unrealistic, that's this and that's that, it's ridiculous, you can't expect that to be functional. Let's remember in 1789, it was shortly thereafter that they did a census in the country, and there were estimated to be somewhere around 4 million inhabitants or citizens of the United States, 4 million. Now look at the demographics of who those people are. Again, mostly European settlers that had families, but we know that they came here mainly to get rid of religious oppression, and there was a lot more freedom. Now, again, some of the things that they believed back then were pretty wild, pretty different. Again, you had a lot in the way of slavery, but what you notice with the two people that I have mentioned here, John Jay and John Adams, these are two of the most prolific abolitionists that we've ever had in the country. And the Constitution itself gave the ability for that kind of freedom to be realized. That's why the best abolitionists on the planet were here in this country, wanting to undo what was being done all over the world. And ultimately, it happened here in ways that are different than anywhere else in the world. The Constitution allowed for such a thing. So when John Adams would say this, read his other writings, especially John Jay, the guy that we're going to read about next, was an avid abolitionist, hated the idea of slavery. He was the first Supreme Court justice appointed to that position and resigned it so that he could become the governor of New York and ultimately sign the law that forbade slavery in the state of New York. So interesting people. Boy, when you start to read what these guys had to say, they were profoundly interesting people. Now, by the time that we read this next one, the population of the United States in 1813 would have been somewhere between 8 and 9 million, is what we're thinking. Now, why I mentioned how many people live here? Again, the difference between when one was written and the other is about 24 years. And the demographics of the country had not still changed very much. So you have mainly European settlers who had come here. These are people who were, quote, religious, as they would use the term. And so that's still going to be the lion's share of the population. I was reading one letter from John Jay, and he had talked about there were only 2 times that he could ever remember speaking with somebody who was a proclaimed atheist. And so that was a rarity in their times, let alone the idea of different, quote, religious beliefs. So fast forward to our time, we have anywhere, depending on who you ask, from anywhere from 330 to 350 million people in the country, as opposed to what I've just given you as the numbers here. And the demographics are radically different. And what we've had in that change of demographics is also many, many more different views of reality of religion and of morality, much more humanistic, much more atheistic, much more different religious views entirely. So the things that were said by these men back then don't work so well to our day, because the population of the United States is radically different. So notice what John Jay has to say here. He says this. Now, providence, that's just a way of saying that God, in his will and by his design, providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers. That's what the Constitution gave to them. Now, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and the interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. National prosperity can neither be obtained nor preserved without the favor of providence, or without God's favor. So when he talks about being a Christian nation, he's a very, very intelligent man. This was the first Supreme Court justice that this country had ever had. So when he mentions it as being a Christian nation, he knows full well the Constitution does not call for a theocracy. So what you had is a secular government, but the people who made up the population were primarily Christian, and you would find that in their writings, in their dealings, and how they viewed the world. So you could have a nation that was secular, but it was dominated by people of a Christian worldview. So back to what we see with John Adams, our Constitution was meant for people with a religious backbone, and with that as being their support, and that would be the thing that would help them to self-govern. And if they couldn't govern themselves through religion and morality, then we would have a real problem, because we would get everything other than a biblical worldview dominating why we do what we do. So you don't find this incompatible. And for those people that say, well, there's a separation of church and state, well, tell it to John Jay. So these were men of deep faith, and they were highly involved. And so John Jay, again, these are founders. These are the guys who were there at the inception of the country. John Jay being the first Supreme Court justice, the governor of New York. These are highly influential political figures who are also men of very deep and abiding faith. So how do you reconcile these things? Now let me bring down this slide, and we'll close this out. So when we think about a Christian nationalist, or a person who wants to see the nation governed in a sense where Christian beliefs are kind of dominating, I can see where some people would have a real problem with that. I have no problems saying that I would much prefer to see a person in office who shares my view biblically than somebody who rejects those things and would work against it. So does that mean that I'm a Christian nationalist? Well, my hope's not in the government, and I don't want to see a theocracy. I don't want to see a government that mandates to me what it is that I have to believe in a religious sense, or on matters of faith, because ultimately that can be taken over by some really bad people. And we have examples of that all over the world, when the dominant religious belief of a particular country dominates everything, even to the way that society reacts and interacts. The founders had this interesting dilemma. Were they then to produce a nation that would make it easy for people of religious belief to function and have freedom, but not mandate that you have to believe this and we, the government, say so? They found that great balance. They looked in the nation at people who were of a Christian orientation and view of the world and belief, and they gave them an inordinate amount of freedoms, unlike anywhere else in the world. And the nation did well. They were able to overthrow slavery, especially in the North. That happened much, much earlier than it happened in the South. We fought a civil war over it, but the Constitution afforded that, trying to get away from the way that the world was to the way that it is. Now, people can go ahead and debate that when this is not about slavery, but you can just, again, if that's a branch of the history that you want to look at the abolitionist movement and look at how it was done as much as they could in the governmental sense until finally society figured it out. But unfortunately, Even at that, there were people who resisted it. But as far as the Constitution is concerned, and the way that the government is comprised, the founders realized full well they did not want to institute a theocracy. What they wanted to do was give people the maximum amount of freedom, recognizing who it was that made up the country. And at the time, the country was made up primarily of people coming from the same part of the world who had the Christian belief of what the Bible teaches, Old and New Testament, and it influenced everything that they did in their lives, and it certainly influenced much of the way that they put together policy as far as the country's concerned. But it was, again, for all of this time, all the way up to the writings that you had here with John Jay, this was before the nation even had 10 million people in it, and they were all pretty similar by comparison to what we have now, with 330 to 350 million different people from all over the world with all manner of different beliefs, much of which is very, very secular, very, very humanist, and of course looks nothing like the founders. So watch any politician, listen to anything that they have to say, and even the ones who are like on a policy level going out of their way to put their thumb in God's eye will, when it's appropriate for them to do it or when they think that it's helpful, they'll quote the Bible until they turn blue in the face. They don't believe a word of it, and they're doing it just because it's a political means to an end. And it's pretty despicable, but it's what I would expect. And it's what you would have in a society that doesn't mandate religion, but affords a great deal of freedom. People can say any variety of things, and it's why when we look at the world around us, why is it melting down the way that it is, and especially in our country? People have still an inordinate amount of freedom compared to the rest of the world. And if the people who have that amount of freedom are not governed by something above themselves, in this case, God saying, this is what I would expect of you, this is what I would not expect of you. If they don't govern themselves by something higher than themselves, you're going to get exactly what we're looking at. And the amount of hatred and the amount of anger that is expressed towards people like Charlie and others, I don't know that it gets any better. Again, when I look at the Bible, I don't think that the world is doing really, really great when the Lord returns. That's not what we're told. So, to put a nice little finishing touch on this, as far as Charlie is concerned, I can't speak to exactly how much he knew about the various beliefs of the people that were around him. It seems like he had his hands pretty full with a whole lot of other things. But I think if he really had genuinely understood who it was that he was interacting with, he may not have wanted to lend as much of his own personal, capital in doing things with them, because I believe that in a lot of ways they were pulling in a very different direction. And I think that there were times where he was just very useful to their ends, but they were not on the same page. So if in the best case scenario, he may have been very much naive to these things. So if you've got videos and things where you can see and you've noticed that he said things very, very favorable and really could express and explain the theology behind the seven mountains and dominionism, that he was in agreement with it, by all means, let me know and send it to me. But once again, I think people like him, and who knows where it goes from here. All the things with Turning Point will be very, very interesting to watch as they go forward, and how much I think organizations like that, because I have heard a number of other people from Turning Point who clearly are not in the know when it comes to major biblical themes, let alone theologies, that may very well have people hitch their wagons to them because they have the ability to advance the movement, but not even understand who is really behind them and what is their belief in the theological sense. Very, very interesting things. 6 months from now, a year from now, who knows what we're going to see. But very, very interesting times. If you have any questions on any of this, the trip to Israel, the topics that we did here, the introduction to the prophets, contact me through the ministry's website, Old Path Theology, and I'd love to have a discussion with you if you have any questions on it.